When Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, passed away in March of 180 CE at Vindobona, modern-day Vienna, the Roman Empire entered a decisive turning point. His death marked the end of what many historians call the Age of the Five Good Emperors, a golden era of relative stability, prosperity, and wise governance that had stretched from Nerva to Marcus himself. His son and successor, Lucius Aurelius Commodus, would bring about a dramatic shift in the fortunes of Rome. Unlike his predecessors, who had been chosen for their merit and experience, Commodus inherited the throne by bloodline. He was the first biological son to succeed his father as emperor since Titus, and his reign would become notorious in the annals of Roman history. Commodus was not just another emperor in the line of succession. He embodied the transformation of the empire from principate to autocracy, from reasoned governance to spectacle, and from stability to chaos. His story, beginning with his early years and the circumstances of his rise, illuminates the vulnerabilities of Rome at the height of its power. Commodus was born on August 31, 161 CE, at Lanuvium, near Rome. He was the 10th child of Marcus Aurelius and Faustina the Younger. Though most of his siblings died young, from birth, Commodus was set apart. He was born into the purple, which was a rare privilege. His father, Marcus Aurelius, was already co-emperor with Lucius Verus at the time, and this made Commodus a child of immense promise in the eyes of the Roman people. The presence of an imperial heir, born during the reign of a sitting emperor, was itself a significant moment, symbolizing dynastic continuity. It was a stark departure from the adoptive succession that had characterized the Nerva-Antonine dynasty. Unlike emperors chosen for their wisdom and ability, Commodus's path was set by heritage, a shift that would later prove disastrous. From a young age, Commodus was marked out for leadership. He was given the title Caesar at the tender age of 5 in 166 CE, and later he was granted the title Imperator in 176 CE, when he was only 15 years old. By the time he was 16, Marcus Aurelius had named him co-emperor, making him the youngest ever to hold that title. This premature elevation reflected Marcus Aurelius's desire to secure the dynasty and ensure stability for Rome. Yet, Marcus's choice was shaped not only by paternal affection, but also by the weariness of his own reign. Marcus had spent much of his life defending the empire's frontiers, particularly against Germanic tribes in the north, and he wanted a smooth transition for his son. The philosopher king, however, may have underestimated both the corrupting influence of absolute power and the weaknesses of his heir. Commodus's upbringing was carefully designed to prepare him for rule. Tutors were selected from among Rome's finest philosophers, grammarians, and orators. Marcus Aurelius himself, steeped in Stoic philosophy, hoped to instill in his son the values of discipline, restraint, and justice. However, historical accounts suggest that Commodus lacked the intellectual depth and moral fiber of his father. Ancient sources such as Cassius Dio, Herodian, and the Historia Augusta describe him as lazy, arrogant, and more interested in games and amusements than in the burdens of governance. Whether these accounts were exaggerated by senatorial hostility remains a matter of debate, but the contrast between Marcus and Commodus was stark and undeniable. In his early years as Caesar and co-emperor, Commodus accompanied his father on military campaigns. He was present during the Marcomannic Wars, where Marcus Aurelius had spent much of his reign fighting against Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier. In 178 CE, Commodus joined his father in the field, and together they sought to secure Rome's northern borders. For Marcus, this was not only a strategic necessity, but also a way to train his son in the arts of war and leadership. Commodus, however, showed little inclination for the hardships of the campaign. Unlike his father, who endured the rigors of the military camp and shared the hardships of his soldiers, Commodus preferred the comforts of luxury and the pleasures of the court. This disinterest in warfare and military duty would later have profound consequences for Rome. as the emperor increasingly delegated responsibility to others while he indulged in personal pursuits. The succession of Commodus in 180 CE, following Marcus's death, marked a dramatic rupture in Roman history. Marcus Aurelius, dying on the Danube frontier, left the empire secure but exhausted. His final act was to entrust it to his son. The army, loyal to Marcus and bound by oaths of allegiance, accepted Commodus without hesitation. The Senate, though wary, confirmed the young man's position, for he was the legitimate heir. At just 18 years old, Commodus became the sole ruler of the Roman world. His reign began with high hopes. The Roman people, weary of decades of war, looked to the young emperor as a symbol of renewal and peace. One of Commodus's first acts as emperor was to negotiate peace with the Germanic tribes. Unlike Marcus, who had intended to continue the wars and annex new territory across the Danube, Commodus sought a quick settlement. He signed treaties with the Marcomanni and Quadi, securing favorable terms but abandoning his father's vision of permanent conquest. To many, this seemed like a wise move. The empire was stretched thin, its resources drained, and its people weary of war. Peace brought relief, and Commodus returned to Rome in triumph. Yet to others, particularly the military elite, this decision revealed weakness. It suggested that the young emperor lacked the resolve of his predecessors. For the Senate and the generals, the new emperor's priorities were clear. He valued comfort and popularity over long-term security. The entry of Commodus into Rome in 180 CE was a spectacle of grandeur. The city welcomed him with celebrations, viewing him as the dawn of a new era. He was young, handsome, and the legitimate heir of a beloved emperor. The people expected stability and prosperity, and Commodus initially delivered. He lavished games, spectacles, and distributions of grain to please the populace. The Roman masses adored such generosity, and Commodus soon learned that he could win their affection not through wise governance, but through entertainment and largesse. This realization would shape much of his rule, transforming the emperor into a figure more akin to a showman than a statesman. Despite his early popularity with the people, Commodus quickly alienated the Senate and the governing elite. Unlike his father, who had treated the Senate with respect and engaged in consultation, Commodus viewed the senators with disdain. He distrusted them, perhaps due to their aristocratic arrogance, and he increasingly surrounded himself with freedmen, favorites, and palace officials. This shift marked a profound change in Roman governance. The Senate, once a vital institution under the Principate, was reduced to a ceremonial body, while real power was concentrated in the emperor's court. Figures such as Saturus, a freedman of Nicomedia, rose to positions of immense influence, earning the hostility of the Roman aristocracy. Commodus's reliance on favorites and courtiers soon led to corruption and intrigue. His court became notorious for excesses, bribes, and conspiracies. The emperor himself, disinterested in administration, delegated much of the work to others. This created opportunities for unscrupulous officials to exploit their positions for personal gain. The sale of offices, the abuse of justice, and the exploitation of provincial resources became rampant. For the Senate and the traditional aristocracy, this was intolerable. They saw in Commodus not a partner in governance, but a tyrant who undermined their dignity and eroded the traditions of Rome. While the elite seethed with resentment, the Roman populace continued to enjoy the fruits of Commodus's generosity. He invested heavily in games and spectacles, spending lavishly to entertain the people. Gladiatorial contests, chariot races, and wild beast hunts filled the calendar. Commodus himself would later take to the arena, performing as a gladiator and shocking the Roman world. In these early years, however, his role was still that of a patron of entertainment rather than a participant. The masses adored him for his largesse, and as long as the bread and circuses continued, their loyalty remained secure. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming in the foundations of his rule. The peace with the Germanic tribes was fragile, and the empire's northern frontier remained vulnerable. The Senate's hostility was growing, fueled by resentment against Commodus's favorites and by the emperor's disdainful behavior. Even within the palace, rivalries and conspiracies simmered as ambitious figures sought to manipulate the young ruler. Commodus, barely out of adolescence, was thrust into a maelstrom of intrigue, corruption, and expectation. His reign was only beginning, but the path it would take was already being shaped by his character and choices. In the first years of his rule, Commodus presented two faces to Rome. To the people, he was the generous benefactor. The emperor who ended the wars returned in triumph and showered them with entertainment. To the Senate and elite, he was a dangerous young man, unfit for rule, prone to arrogance, and surrounded by unscrupulous favorites. These conflicting perceptions would define the trajectory of his reign. Over time, his neglect of governance, his indulgence in pleasures, and his descent into spectacle would transform him into one of the most infamous emperors in Roman history. By the early 180 CE, the hopes that Commodus might continue the legacy of his father were already beginning to fade. The philosopher's son had inherited an empire at the height of its power, but he lacked the wisdom, restraint, and discipline to preserve it. Instead, he sought refuge in spectacle, distraction, and indulgence. His reign, though beginning with peace and popularity, carried within it the seeds of Rome's decline. As Cassius Dio, one of his contemporaries, would later write, Marcus Aurelius' decision to leave the empire to his son was the beginning of our present troubles. Thus, the story of Commodus begins not as a tale of immediate chaos, but as a gradual unraveling. The philosopher's heir entered the stage of history with every advantage: youth, legitimacy, popularity, and a secure empire. Yet his flaws, his disdain for tradition, and his craving for spectacle soon set him apart from his predecessors. The reign that began with promise would descend into infamy, reshaping the Roman Empire and leaving behind a legacy of tyranny and corruption. Part 1 of his story closes with Commodus firmly seated on the throne, celebrated by the people, distrusted by the Senate, and already showing signs of the excesses that would define his rule. The empire stood at a crossroads, and its fate now rested in the hands of an emperor who preferred the sword of the gladiator to the stylus of the statesman. When Marcus Aurelius died in March of 180 CE, the Roman Empire was left in the hands of his 19-year-old son, Commodus. The boy had been present at his father's deathbed, perhaps overwhelmed by the immense responsibility suddenly thrust upon him. At first, his rule showed signs of continuity. After all, Marcus Aurelius had spent his life preparing Commodus for leadership. He had made him consul at the age of 15, an unprecedented honor, and taken him along on military campaigns in the north against the Marcomanni and Quadi. But Commodus was not Marcus. The father was a philosopher king, admired for his stoicism, his devotion to duty, and his austere life. The son was energetic, indulgent, and far more drawn to pleasure and spectacle than philosophy or governance. This contrast would soon reshape the entire character of Roman rule. In the early months of his reign, Commodus sought stability. He quickly made peace with the Germanic tribes along the Danube, ending the long and costly Marcomannic wars that had drained Rome's resources during Marcus Aurelius' final years. While his father had been close to victory, and perhaps dreamed of incorporating new provinces into the empire beyond the Danube, Commodus saw little glory in continuing the struggle. His first action as emperor was to negotiate a treaty that allowed the empire to withdraw its legions, leaving a fragile peace, but sparing Rome the further expense of war. This decision was greeted with relief by soldiers and citizens weary of conflict, but many senators saw it as weakness. To them, Marcus' project of conquest had been abandoned. Commodus, however, believed that peace would allow him to enjoy Rome as wealth and focus on life in the capital rather than the battlefield. Returning to Rome in triumph, Commodus presented himself as a victorious ruler though he had not personally commanded in the war. The Senate initially received him with the honor due to an emperor, but tensions soon surfaced. Commodus, unlike his father, had little respect for the Senate's traditions or its dignified role in governance. He saw senatorial authority as an obstacle to his personal power and pleasure. While Marcus Aurelius had patiently balanced senatorial dignity with imperial prerogative, Commodus openly disregarded them, trusting instead in his freedmen, chamberlains, and the Praetorian Guard. This reliance on courtiers and guards created a new style of government in which imperial favorites gained immense influence. Early in his reign, Commodus delegated much of the work of administration to trusted advisors. Among them, the Chamberlain Sauterus, a freedman from Nicomedia, became a powerful figure. His influence, however, stirred resentment in the Senate, which despised the rise of freedmen and equestrians at their expense. Sauterus' enemies quickly sought to undermine him, and within a short time he was assassinated, perhaps with Commodus' knowledge, perhaps not. The power vacuum was filled by Tigidius Perennis, the Praetorian prefect, who emerged as Commodus' chief advisor. Perennis was competent, energetic, and ruthless. For a while, he managed the empire efficiently, keeping order and protecting Commodus from direct criticism. Yet his growing power and ambition made him dangerous. By 185 CE, whispers reached Commodus that Perennis was plotting against him. Whether true or fabricated, the result was inevitable. Commodus ordered Perennis' execution, a pattern that would repeat with nearly every trusted advisor throughout his reign. These purges reveal an essential feature of Commodus' personality. He was suspicious, erratic, and easily swayed by rumor. Although he wanted others to manage the empire, he distrusted those who grew too powerful. As a result, the imperial court became a revolving door of advisors, chamberlains, and prefects, each rising to prominence only to be destroyed by imperial paranoia or court intrigue. After Perennis' fall, Clender, another chamberlain, assumed control of the emperor's household and government. Unlike Perennis, Clender was openly corrupt. He sold offices and appointments to the highest bidder, enriching himself while draining the dignity of the state. Under Clender, corruption flourished. Roman citizens and senators alike despised him, but Commodus tolerated his greed as long as he remained loyal. For a time, this arrangement worked, but the resentment eventually boiled over into violence. During these years, Commodus' own character underwent a transformation. Initially cautious, he grew increasingly reckless and self-indulgent. His love for games, festivals, and gladiatorial contests became a defining feature of his reign. Unlike previous emperors, who sponsored games for the people, Commodus chose to participate in them himself. He shocked Roman society by appearing in the arena as a gladiator, fighting wild beasts and performing in staged combats. The people of Rome enjoyed the spectacle. After all, their emperor was entertaining them directly. But the Senate and aristocracy were horrified. To them, gladiators were the lowest of the low, often slaves or criminals. For the emperor to don their armor and fight in the arena was a disgrace to imperial dignity. Commodus, however, reveled in these displays. He styled himself as a new Hercules, adopting the costume of the demigod and even carrying a club as his symbol. He had statues erected depicting himself in this guise, portraying the emperor as a divine hero destined to conquer beasts and men alike. This fusion of divine imagery and gladiatorial performance created a bizarre new imperial identity. Commodus was no longer merely the head of state. He was a living god, a champion, a gladiator emperor. For the people of Rome, especially the urban masses who loved games and free spectacles, this was thrilling. For the senators and elites, it was appalling. This growing divide between the emperor and the Senate shaped the politics of his reign. Senators who opposed him risked death. Commodus frequently ordered executions on the slightest suspicion of conspiracy. Noble families were stripped of wealth and power, their estates confiscated to fund the emperor as extravagant lifestyle and the ever-rising costs of games and spectacles. The emperor's paranoia intensified, and Rome became a dangerous place for the political elite. At the same time, his growing detachment from actual governance meant that the empire's administration increasingly fell into disorder. Provinces were mismanaged, the military's discipline eroded, and the economy strained under the burdens of corruption and spending. Yet Commodus retained popularity with the common people of Rome, largely because of his spectacles. Bread and circuses had always been central to Roman politics, and Commodus delivered both. He showered the masses with games, distributed grain, and ensured that the capital remained entertained. For the average citizen, the emperor's eccentricities mattered little compared to the pleasures of the arena. But for the empire as a whole, the costs were immense. The treasury, carefully managed under Marcus Aurelius, was now depleted. The frontiers, once secured by careful campaigns, were increasingly vulnerable. Rome's stability rested on a fragile balance, sustained by spectacle and fear. The reign of Commodus also saw the rise of conspiracy and assassination attempts. His erratic behavior, his disdain for the Senate, and his indulgence in gladiatorial games fueled opposition. In 182 CE, a plot led by his own sister Lucilla, the widow of Lucius Verus, sought to kill him. Lucilla, fearing for her own position and frustrated by Commodus' conduct, organized conspirators to assassinate the emperor, but the attempt failed and Commodus' wrath was swift. Lucilla was exiled and later executed, along with many of her allies. This betrayal by his own sister deepened Commodus' suspicion of everyone around him. From then on, he trusted almost no one, retreating further into the company of sycophants and guards who encouraged his extravagance while isolating him from reality. As the years passed, Commodus increasingly identified himself with gladiatorial combat and divine heroism. He appeared in the Colosseum hundreds of times, slaying animals and fighting mock battles. Ancient sources claim he killed lions, leopards, elephants, and even a giraffe in staged hunts. His displays were carefully orchestrated to ensure his safety, but the people marveled at his prowess. Commodus demanded fees for these performances, requiring the city of Rome to pay him as if he were a professional gladiator. This humiliating demand enraged the Senate, who saw it as an insult to their authority. Yet the emperor was unmoved, basking in the adoration of the crowds. Commodus' reign thus entered a new phase, one in which spectacle replaced governance and fear replaced respect. His obsession with being seen as Hercules, as a gladiator, and as a god made him increasingly disconnected from the realities of empire. He renamed months of the year after himself and Hercules, reshaped Rome's institutions around his own cult, and demanded worship. The Senate, reduced to a ceremonial role, grew ever more resentful, but any open opposition was met with execution. Meanwhile, corruption under Clender and others reached staggering heights. Offices were openly bought and sold, justice was perverted, and the empire's bureaucracy decayed. The climax of Cleander's corruption came in 190 CE when a famine struck Rome. The people, desperate for grain, rioted. Rumors spread that Clender was hoarding supplies for profit. The mob turned against him, and the Praetorian Guard intervened. Commodus, fearing the people's anger, allowed Clender to be executed, sacrificing his chamberlain to appease the masses. Once again, the emperor had destroyed his closest advisor, leaving the court in turmoil. But this pattern of instability only deepened. By the midpoint of his reign, Commodus had become a figure both feared and ridiculed. To the masses, he was a source of entertainment. To the Senate, a tyrant unworthy of his father's legacy. His neglect of governance and his indulgence in personal glory created cracks in the empire's stability that would soon widen into chaos. What began as a young emperor's retreat from war had transformed into a reign of paranoia, spectacle, and corruption. When Commodus returned to Rome after abandoning the northern frontiers and leaving the military campaign to his generals, the empire entered a new phase that historians often call the beginning of Rome's decline. Unlike his father Marcus Aurelius, Commodus had little interest in philosophy, governance, or military discipline. He preferred indulgence, luxury, and entertainment. Rome, under his reign, became less about senatorial debates, military campaigns, and imperial reforms, and more about gladiatorial shows, conspiracies, corruption, and the emperor's personal pleasures. In this part of his life and rule, we witness the transformation of Commodus from a flawed but manageable ruler into a paranoid, tyrannical despot whose decisions destabilized Rome and led to chaos in the imperial administration. At the beginning of this period, Commodus still enjoyed popularity among the Roman people. The masses, who often suffered under austere and militaristic emperors, liked Commodus for his generosity, games, and spectacles. He frequently staged lavish gladiatorial contests, circus events, and beast hunts to entertain the public. However, unlike emperors before him who sponsored these events but remained apart from the action, Commodus wanted to be the star attraction. He trained as a gladiator and often entered the arena himself, fighting wild beasts or even challenging other gladiators. This was seen by many senators and members of the elite as degrading and beneath the dignity of the emperor, but to the common people, it was thrilling. Commodus styled himself as Hercules reborn, often appearing in public wearing lion skins and carrying a club like the mythic hero. Statues and coins from his reign depicted him not only as emperor, but also as Hercules, a living god destined to rule the world. Behind this public persona, the empire's administration began to collapse. Commodus was uninterested in the daily responsibilities of ruling and instead delegated authority to favorites, freedmen, and corrupt officials. One of the most notorious figures in this regard was Clender, a freedman who became Commodus's chamberlain and de facto ruler of Rome. Clender sold public offices, governorships, and military commands to the highest bidder, leading to rampant corruption and incompetence in provincial administrations. Soldiers, governors, and senators began to realize that loyalty to the emperor was less important than bribing his favorites. The Roman state, once governed by a balance of senatorial tradition and imperial authority, was now controlled by greed, opportunism, and favoritism. Meanwhile, Commodus himself retreated further into a world of pleasure and paranoia. He indulged in feasts, orgies, and entertainment while neglecting the threats facing the empire. On the northern frontiers, the Germanic tribes pushed back against Rome's retreating forces, while in the east, unrest simmered in the provinces. Yet Commodus preferred the safety of the Colosseum and the Palatine Palace over the battlefield. His reign was marked by a series of plots and conspiracies, most of which were brutally crushed. One of the earliest conspiracies was orchestrated by his own sister Lucilla, who feared his erratic behavior and sought to replace him with a more stable ruler. The plot failed, Lucilla was executed, and Commodus grew increasingly suspicious of those around him. Paranoia became a defining feature of his rule. Senators, generals, and even family members were accused of treason and executed without trial. The Senate, once a respected body that guided imperial policy, was humiliated and reduced to silence. The emperor's obsession with being seen as a godlike figure further alienated the elite. He ordered that Rome be renamed Colonia Commodiana, or the colony of Commodus. The months of the year were renamed after his own titles, and statues of Hercules Commodus were erected throughout the city. To his mind, he was not merely an emperor, but a divine ruler destined to bring a new golden age. To the senators, however, this was madness and megalomania. Still, they dared not oppose him openly for fear of death. Despite his cruelty and excess, Commodus continued to maintain popularity with the masses by feeding them entertainment and occasional distributions of grain and money. Bread and circuses became the hallmark of his rule. The more brutal his governance became, the more he tried to appease the public with spectacles. In the Colosseum, he fought against animals, though many of these fights were carefully staged to ensure his safety. Lions, tigers, bears, and even elephants were slain by the emperor in front of roaring crowds. At times, he would kill dozens of animals in a single day, proclaiming himself the greatest gladiator and hunter in history. He even forced gladiators and nobles to fight against him, though most were not allowed to harm him seriously. These spectacles may have entertained the masses, but they drained the empire as treasury and damaged Rome's dignity in the eyes of the world. The role of the Praetorian Guard during this period cannot be overlooked. The elite bodyguards of the emperor were both his protectors and potential threats. Commodus lavished them with gifts, money, and privileges to secure their loyalty. However, their loyalty was often tied to whoever paid them the most, and they became deeply involved in the politics of the empire. Assassinations, plots, and changes of power often depended on the Praetorian Guard's support. Under Commodus, their corruption grew alongside that of the imperial court. As the years progressed, Rome's economy began to suffer. With much of the empire's finances diverted to games, gifts, and corruption, the provinces struggled with heavy taxation. Farmers and peasants bore the burden, while officials enriched themselves. Trade routes were increasingly threatened by bandits and pirates as Rome's military discipline weakened. Commodus's detachment from these crises worsened the situation. Instead of addressing economic decline, he declared himself the new founder of Rome, a godlike savior who needed no advice or criticism. The arrogance of this claim further angered senators and historians alike, who saw in him the embodiment of Rome's decay. It was during this time that Commodus's paranoia and cruelty reached new extremes. Anyone suspected of conspiracy was executed, often without evidence. The executions were brutal, with victims sometimes killed in the arena as part of public spectacles. The emperor seemed to take delight in seeing his enemies humiliated before their deaths. The Senate, cowed and fearful, became nothing more than a rubber stamp for his decrees. Intellectual and philosophical life, which had flourished under Marcus Aurelius, declined sharply under Commodus's reign. Scholars, writers, and philosophers avoided public life for fear of persecution. By the later years of his rule, Commodus had almost entirely abandoned governance. He lived as a celebrity gladiator, obsessed with his image as Hercules, and indulging in pleasures while the empire crumbled. The daily administration of the empire was left to Clender and other corrupt officials, whose greed sparked unrest even among the people. When a grain shortage hit Rome, riots broke out, and the crowd turned on Clender, demanding his execution. Fearing for his life, Commodus ordered Cleander's death, sacrificing his trusted advisor to calm the mob. But this did little to solve the deeper problems of his reign. In conclusion, the third phase of Commodus's rule reveals the transformation of an emperor who could have preserved the legacy of Marcus Aurelius into a tyrant whose paranoia, cruelty, and megalomania weakened Rome. By neglecting military duty, undermining the Senate, and replacing governance with gladiatorial showmanship, Commodus set the stage for disaster. The empire that had been held together by discipline, philosophy, and strategic leadership was now a fragile shell, maintained only by bribes, fear, and entertainment. His reign was a warning of what happens when power is unchecked, when leadership is replaced by vanity, and when an empire's foundations are corroded by corruption. The decline of Rome, often debated by historians, is frequently traced back to this period, when an emperor turned away from responsibility and chose to live as a tyrant in the guise of a gladiator. By the year 189 CE, Commodus' reign had already taken on the shape of chaos, instability, and a grotesque parody of the principled rule of his predecessors. What had once been an empire guided by the disciplined hands of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius was now subjected to the unpredictable whims of a man more concerned with personal glorification than governance. Commodus was no longer merely negligent in his duties as emperor. He had grown actively destructive, dismantling the very foundations upon which the Roman Empire rested. This period in Commodus' reign marks the final descent into madness, a reign characterized by unchecked tyranny, bizarre self-deification, relentless gladiatorial excess, and a government paralyzed by corruption and fear. The fourth phase of his rule, spanning the years 189 CE to 191 CE, captures Commodus at his most reckless and self-indulgent when the empire itself seemed to teeter at the edge of collapse. By this stage, Commodus had almost entirely abandoned the responsibilities of state. He no longer appeared in the Senate or took interest in administrative affairs, leaving governance wholly to his favorites and sycophants. Figures like Clender, his powerful chamberlain, exercised de facto control over the empire, selling public offices, governorships, and military commands to the highest bidder. Rome became a marketplace of power, where loyalty was measured in coin, and ambition was satisfied not through merit or achievement, but by bribery. This rampant corruption weakened the empire's structure, allowing incompetent men to hold critical positions and leaving provinces vulnerable to mismanagement and unrest. To the Senate and the aristocracy, the emperor was no longer a guardian of order, but a threat to the very survival of Rome's traditions and dignity. Yet Commodus himself was uninterested in such criticisms. He was consumed by fantasies of grandeur, particularly his obsession with identifying himself as Hercules reincarnated. By this time, he had taken to appearing in public adorned with the lion-skin cloak and wielding the wooden club of Hercules. Statues across the empire were altered to depict Commodus not as a Roman emperor in traditional garb, but as the muscular demigod. Inscriptions proclaimed him the Roman Hercules, and coins were minted bearing his likeness in divine form. This was not mere vanity, it was delusion. Commodus demanded recognition as a living god, and his narcissism seeped into every corner of Roman life. The Senate was forced to address him with divine titles, while citizens were expected to accept his claims without protest. Such demands further alienated him from Rome's traditionalist elite, who saw in his behavior not only impiety, but also madness. His obsession with gladiatorial combat also reached its zenith during these years. Commodus' participation in the games was no longer a rare spectacle, but a regular occurrence. He fought in the arena hundreds of times, though his opponents were often unarmed or handicapped, ensuring his victory. He reveled in theatrics, slaying wild animals with javelins from the safety of platforms, or dispatching wounded gladiators with a flourish meant to entertain the crowd. To the Roman populace, these displays were thrilling and unforgettable, but to the Senate, they were disgraceful, an emperor lowering himself to the level of slaves and criminals. Worse still, Commodus demanded enormous sums of money for his appearances, charging the city for each performance and draining the imperial treasury. What had once been a symbol of imperial generosity, the games funded to delight the people, became an instrument of personal enrichment. By 190 CE, the atmosphere in Rome was suffocating under Commodus' tyranny. Clender, the emperor's corrupt favorite, had by then monopolized the sale of offices, amassing vast wealth, but also making enemies among senators, equestrians, and ordinary citizens alike. His greed triggered a crisis when grain shortages struck Rome. The people, already frustrated by rising prices, and the sense that their emperor was indifferent to their suffering, erupted in riots. The mob laid the blame on Clender, storming the Circus Maximus during the games to demand justice. Commodus, alarmed by the intensity of the uprising, panicked. In a move characteristic of his cowardice and paranoia, he abandoned his loyal chamberlain, ordering Cleander's execution to placate the masses. For the people of Rome, it was a temporary victory, but it revealed the emperor's fragility. Commodus' power was sustained only by violence, and he would discard even his closest allies when threatened. Following Cleander's downfall, Commodus retreated even further into his fantasies, becoming more detached from reality. He began to restructure time itself according to his whims, renaming the months of the year after his divine titles. December, for example, was renamed Commodus, while other months carried epithets like Hercules, Invincible, or Pious. Rome itself he rechristened as Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, and the legions of the empire were renamed the Commodianae legions. Every aspect of Roman identity, from its calendar to its geography, was twisted to reflect Commodus' self-obsession. The emperor no longer saw himself as one among many rulers in Rome's long history, but as the singular eternal figure upon whom the destiny of the world depended. This transformation of Rome into a stage for Commodus' ego left the empire dangerously unstable. Provincial governors, chosen not for competence, but for their ability to pay for office, proved unable to manage local crises. In Africa, grain shipments faltered, worsening food shortages in the capital. In the Danubian frontier, troops grew restless as leadership faltered. The Senate was powerless, reduced to a body that performed only ceremonial functions and approved Commodus' endless honors. Those who resisted risked death, for Commodus had little patience for dissent. Senators were executed on charges of conspiracy, their estates confiscated to fund the emperor's games and pleasures. Fear gripped the aristocracy, who lived under constant suspicion of imperial wrath. Meanwhile, Commodus' increasingly erratic behavior eroded the respect of the military, Rome's most vital pillar of power. While the soldiers enjoyed the donatives he distributed, they could not ignore the emperor's negligence of military campaigns. Unlike his father Marcus Aurelius, who had lived and fought alongside the legions, Commodus preferred the safety and spectacle of the Colosseum. The Danube frontier remained volatile, and though no massive invasion had yet occurred, the empire's defenses were weakened by the emperor's inattention. The soldiers admired strength, discipline, and leadership. In Commodus, they saw only vanity and indulgence. By the end of 191 CE, Commodus' reign had become unsustainable. The empire was bankrupt, its treasury depleted by gains, monuments, and bribes. The grain supply was fragile, the provinces were restless, and the aristocracy was simmering with resentment. Most critically, the people who once adored Commodus for his gladiatorial exploits began to grow weary of his endless spectacles, recognizing that their emperor was more concerned with his own amusement than their welfare. Behind closed doors, conspiracies brewed as senators, generals, and even members of Commodus' household recognized that Rome could not endure much longer under such leadership. In this final phase of descent, Commodus was both the most powerful and the most vulnerable man in the empire. He wielded the absolute authority of an emperor who styled himself a god, yet his paranoia, arrogance, and detachment from reality isolated him from allies. He had alienated the Senate, exhausted the treasury, weakened the army's respect, and disillusioned the people. The emperor who fancied himself Hercules the Invincible was, in truth, a man surrounded by enemies, his fate sealed by the very excesses that had defined his reign. Part 4 of Commodus' story reveals the destructive climax of his rule, the years when Rome itself seemed to collapse into the abyss of his delusions. What lay ahead, in the final chapter of his reign, was inevitable: assassination, the ultimate punishment for an emperor who mistook tyranny and spectacle for leadership. The final years of Commodus' reign marked the collapse of Rome's golden age and the beginning of an era of turmoil. By the time the emperor reached the early 190 CE, the empire had transformed from a structured, disciplined, and prosperous machine into a fractured state racked by fear, political assassinations, and instability. Commodus, once the heir of Marcus Aurelius, had abandoned all pretenses of governing with reason. He believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules, paraded himself as a living god, and forced the Senate and people of Rome to worship him. In this final stage of his reign, Commodus's obsession with divine identity, his brutal gladiatorial performances, and his detachment from actual governance eroded the empire's foundations. The consequences of his downfall would plunge Rome into the so-called Year of the Five Emperors and mark the true end of the Antonine dynasty. By 190 CE, Commodus's transformation from emperor to despot was complete. He renamed the city of Rome Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, meaning the colony of Commodus. He even renamed the months of the year after his own titles, ensuring that the calendar itself became an eternal monument to his vanity. The Senate, humiliated and powerless, was forced to address him as Hercules Romanus and Dominus Deus, or Lord God. He appeared in public dressed in lion skins, carrying a club, and claimed to be the earthly embodiment of Hercules, Jupiter, and other gods simultaneously. These spectacles would have been laughable if they did not carry such grave consequences. Those who refused to honor him as divine faced death. Commodus's reign no longer resembled that of an emperor, but that of a tyrant who believed himself chosen by the gods to rule without question. Meanwhile, Rome itself was deteriorating. The city was plagued by corruption, food shortages, and mismanagement. The Praetorian prefect Clender, who had once held immense power under Commodus, organized the sale of public offices to the highest bidder. This practice not only drained Rome of resources, but also filled key positions with unqualified men whose only loyalty was to bribes and favoritism. When food shortages struck the city in 190 CE, riots broke out. The mob directed their anger at Clender, who attempted to suppress them with cavalry. However, the people stormed into the palace and demanded Commodus take action. To save himself, Commodus turned on Clender and had him executed, along with his family. This event revealed a pattern that had become all too common under Commodus. Whenever crisis threatened, he sacrificed his advisors, ministers, or generals to preserve his throne. Loyalty to Commodus was worthless, as no ally remained safe from his paranoia. As political chaos unfolded, Commodus retreated further into fantasy. His true passion was no longer governance, but the gladiatorial games. Unlike past emperors who occasionally appeared in the arena, Commodus fought constantly, turning the Colosseum into his personal theater. He entered the arena dressed as Hercules, slaying animals such as lions, elephants, and giraffes, often from a safe distance with bow or spear. He also fought gladiators, though these opponents were often forced to submit to him, or were armed only with wooden weapons. Commodus's victories were staged, but he demanded recognition as the greatest gladiator in history. Ancient sources claim he fought in the arena more than 700 times, though these numbers may be exaggerated. Nevertheless, each performance drained the treasury, as the emperor paid himself extravagant sums of money from the state for his appearances. To the Roman elite, his behavior was a disgrace. To the common people, it was entertainment, though even the masses grew weary of his excesses. By 191 CE, Commodus's mental instability became apparent even to his closest supporters. He began to plot a radical transformation of the empire. He declared that the first day of 193 CE would mark a new beginning. Rome would no longer be ruled by the Senate or governed by its traditions, but would instead be a new world ruled entirely in his name. Commodus planned to rename the empire itself the Commodian Empire. He saw himself not as the successor of Augustus or Marcus Aurelius, but as a god who had recreated Rome in his own image. His fantasies, however, created enemies. Senators, military leaders, and even palace officials realized that his reign threatened the survival of the state. Assassination conspiracies became increasingly common, though most failed and led only to more purges. One of the most famous assassination attempts came from his own sister, Lucilla. Lucilla, who had once plotted against Commodus earlier in his reign, had watched as Rome sank into chaos. Along with a group of senators, she orchestrated an attempt to kill him in public. The plot failed when the would-be assassin foolishly announced, "This is what the Senate sends to you," before striking. Commodus easily disarmed the attacker, and the conspiracy was exposed. Lucilla was executed, along with her fellow conspirators. This incident deepened Commodus's paranoia and hatred of the Senate. From this point forward, he rarely appeared in public without heavy guard, and his executions grew more frequent. Despite these threats, Commodus managed to survive until the end of 192 CE. That year, a devastating fire swept through Rome, destroying parts of the city, including the Temple of Pax and the Temple of Vesta. Many Romans interpreted this disaster as a sign of divine anger toward Commodus's rule. Yet Commodus responded not with humility, but with greater arrogance. He proclaimed himself the new Romulus, a founder who would rebuild the city in his image. To commemorate this rebirth, he announced that on New Year's Day, 193 CE, he would appear in the Colosseum not as emperor, but as a gladiator to inaugurate the new age. This proclamation was the final straw for his enemies. For the Senate and elite, the idea that Rome itself would be reborn as a gladiator's playground was intolerable. Plans for his assassination accelerated. The final conspiracy came from within Commodus's own household. His mistress Marcia, once a loyal partner, had grown fearful for her life after Commodus listed her name among those he planned to execute. Along with the chamberlain Eclectus and the praetorian prefect Letus, she plotted to kill the emperor. On December 31st, 192 CE, the conspirators acted. First, Marcia poisoned his wine. Commodus drank, but when he vomited and survived, panic set in. To finish the deed, they called upon a wrestler named Narcissus, who strangled Commodus in his bath. At the age of 31, after nearly 13 years on the throne, the emperor was dead. His death ended the Antonine dynasty, a line that had ruled Rome since the days of Nerva and Trajan. The aftermath of Commodus's death plunged Rome into chaos. The Senate, overjoyed, declared him a public enemy and attempted to erase his memory from history through the practice of damnatio memoria. Statues of Commodus were destroyed, his name was removed from inscriptions, and his decrees were nullified. Yet the damage had already been done. The empire, once stable and prosperous under Marcus Aurelius, now found itself leaderless. Pertinax, a respected senator and military commander, was chosen as emperor, but his reign lasted only 3 months before he was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. The Guard then auctioned the throne to the highest bidder, setting off a civil war that became known as the Year of the Five Emperors. This period of instability would pave the way for Septimius Severus and the Severan dynasty, but it also marked the definitive end of the Pax Romana, the golden age of peace and prosperity that had defined the Antonine period. Looking back, Commodus's reign represents a turning point in Roman history. He inherited an empire at its peak, carefully preserved by his father, Marcus Aurelius. Yet he squandered its stability through vanity, cruelty, and neglect. His obsession with personal glory over public duty alienated the Senate, destabilized the military, and left the people disillusioned. His assassination may have removed the immediate threat, but it could not undo the damage his reign had inflicted on the Roman state. The memory of Commodus lingered as a cautionary tale of what happens when an emperor loses touch with reality and treats Rome not as a republic or empire, but as his personal stage. For centuries, his name would be associated with tyranny, madness, and the fall of a dynasty. Commodus's death was more than the end of a single emperor. It was the end of an era. With him, the stability of the Antonines vanished, and Rome entered a new phase defined by civil wars, military emperors, and growing instability. Though Rome would survive for centuries to come, the empire that Commodus left behind was no longer the same as the one he inherited. The golden age of Rome was gone, replaced by the long struggle to preserve an empire that was already beginning to fracture under the weight of its own contradictions.